remember for Chester A. Arthur, he when he finally became a lawyer around I believe 1853 to 1854, it's basically a very tumultuous time within the country. The Fugitive Slave Act is in motion, and he's vehemently against it. And that's why one of the biggest reasons why he joined the law firm he joined, specifically, or what he was clerking for, was because they were actively against the Fugitive Slave Act. A whole bunch of different things that they felt were unconstitutional in a whole bunch of different ways. I get to understand the feeling of the country a little bit, that I probably went into just a little bit, but not really. On the ground floor, when you're actually in New York and people actually trying to, actually legislate or actively do the actual Fugitive Slave Act, it's a little bit difficult at times for people to really conceptualize certain things when, you have to enforce a law. And, a lot of people on the ground were fighting it for the most part. A lot of people had different perspectives, different points of view. Because you remember, people in the North, they weren't abolitionists by any stretch of the imagination. They were far from it. They were okay in a lot of ways of this weird half-slave, half-free status quo kind of thing, North and South, effectively. And ultimately, it was a bit of a changing of just people's minds, and that was really occurring around this particular point in time. And in fairness to Chester A. Arthur, from the very get-go, he's freedom all the way. And he specifically joined a law firm to fight the atrocities that were occurring very much in the early goings of his career. I mean, the very first case, technically, he was a part of, he wasn't technically a really big factor in it. He'd actually be a big factor in it in the later appeal, because this basically would be appealed numerous times all the way up until about 1860, that Chester A. Arthur effectively would be a part of up until then, was the Lemon v. New York. The whole idea and story was this guy, the slave holder, last name Lemon, ultimately was trying to transport slaves. He was bringing them from Texas to Virginia, but for some reason they made a leeway and stop in New York, and he actually put his slaves in the actual prison for basically safekeeping for the most part. Sounds bad. It sounds terrible. He had 8 slaves with him. I think 6 of them were children, actually. And they found out about it, did habeas corpus, and basically put an action against Jonathan Lemon was his name, and went to court for it, and effectively ended up winning, ultimately, as New York specifically did not permit slavery, and any slave arriving in New York was automatically freed, regardless of the whole Fugitive Slave Act issue, because it was a complicated, legislative situation that they're trying to decipher, ultimately trying to figure out. I mean, that's the big reason why I went to the appeals, the Court of Appeals at the very least, for basically the next half decade, trying to fight it for the most part, as Chester A. Arthur, I think, represented both the state effectively versus the defendant, or whatever you want to call it, in Lemon, and would basically be fighting that for the next roughly 4 or so years. But it's other cases too. The other one that a couple of biographers also note would be the Elizabeth Jennings Graham case. She was in New York and was denied basically a seat on the streetcar because of her specific race, and Arthur was the lead attorney on that case, and ultimately ended up winning that case specifically. And that was one of the big first steps in desegregating New York's streetcar lines for the most part, and seating. That's not what you want to hear. You want to hear about Chester A. Arthur and what he did outside of just the big things that people always cover. Well, he was just like a lot of guys back then. A lot of men, unmarried, used to live in boarding houses. They got close with other single men for the most part. Not in that way, but they would have like family dinners and stuff at the boarding houses that he would usually end up staying at and living at while he was a single man. He made a lot of good friends really around that particular time, fellow boarders, as some would probably say. And a lot of people back then would establish home lives with their bros and homies, In a lot of ways, it's kind of like a family brother hotel, I guess is one way to put it. I think he lived on Broadway in New York. And there, he would basically meet people at these weird boarding houses that people would just live at. It was like weird motels and stuff. Anyways, around that particular point in time, he met a couple of different people. Dabney Herndon, specifically, was one of these individuals that he would frequent for the most part. Dabney Herndon, he was the daughter of William Lewis Herndon. He was, at the time, I believe, a Virginia naval officer. And things get very interesting there, is one way to put it. You see, Chester and Dabney Herndon, a friend, a young medical student, I believe, from Virginia, he would frequently come visit and hang out, and, they lived together effectively around this particular point in time. I think Dabney was in school, and Dabney and Chester would occasionally go visit his family, Dabney's family. They lived nearby, and on a couple of these visits, that's when Chester A. Arthur met Ellen. They called her Nell Lewis Herndon, who caught Chester Arthur's eye. She was 22 years old, and I think at this particular point in time, he was closing in on 30 when they were actually married. Specifically, they were married on October 25th, 1859. But Ellen Nellie Herndon would be the apple of Chester A. Arthur's eye, and they would be married very, very soon. But other than that, other than women, because they would start dating. They would start dating around when he was 27, so I'm getting things mixed up. So, 8 years older, she was 19. They would have basically about a 2-year courtship, I believe. They would soon get engaged, but for Chester A. Arthur, life and work were more important. And again, the country and the health of the country was where things were starting to get a little bit interesting. You have to understand, 1855, 1856, Pierce, he's the current president at the current state and time right now. He's doing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a whole bunch of different things. And the violence is going to be really occurring with, whether Kansas is going to be a free or slave state. So Chester A. Arthur and his friends, basically, a couple of them, decided this guy, Henry D. Gardner, who was going to be, was a good friend of his and another good lawyer, decided they were going to really pursue what they wanted to do, and that was, at the very least, if not a free country, at the very least, to stop the expansion of slavery. They decided they were going to move to Kansas, and they decided that they were going to purchase land and set up their own law practice there in Kansas. Ballers. Once Arthur arrived, things were very, very hectic. He would attempt to, at the very least, establish a bit of a law practice there, but would be relatively unsuccessful. Some of the court cases he would take wouldn't really amount to anything. And to be honest, he was a little bit shook. Kansas was very violent. People were just not friendly with one another in any stretch of the imagination in the places that he would go. He went all over Kansas, ultimately, and all he saw was just violence and anger for the most part. The free soilers and the pro-slavery ruffians were just fighting with one another, and ultimately Arthur was just incredibly frustrated, a little bit disoriented. Decided that after a couple months of doing this, he was going to try and do something else very, very differently, as this direct action ultimately wasn't going to really lead to anything fruitful, at least in his belief, functionally. So soon after, he returned back to New York City to be with Nell and to ultimately try and figure some things out. And it's just around that particular point in time, a new political party was forming. It would be known as the Republican Party. Things were really, really fast-forwarding for young Chester A. Arthur. He just progressed, went fast, he went hard, and he did a lot of things. And for the next, basically, 3 years, from 1856 to probably 1859-ish, while doing he basically did everything. Worked the appeals for that Lemon case. He would eventually get married. He and Nellie would, effectively end up basically just being with each other the entire time, officially getting married in October of 1859, and he would do a lot of things. He would buy his home on 4th Avenue, 21st Street in Manhattan, and they got married at that place, 4th Avenue, 21st Street in Manhattan. It's known as the Calvary Episcopalian Church. He bought a home, 34th West 21st Street. Sorry, there's a whole bunch of different dates that I'm reading right now. And effectively ended up just basically being part of the neighborhood for the rest of his life. He loved that home. I just want to point that out. He was always there, even when he was in Washington. His marriage really prospered. Had a bunch of kids after this too. And also at the very same end of the spectrum, he started really branching out there. His practice that he would set up along with since returning to New York ultimately would flourish as well. He mingled with everyone, the elites of the city, as the Republican Party was really growing, especially in New York. It just grew and grew and grew, and there was no one bigger than basically Chester A. Arthur around that particular point in time. Chester and Nellie, they had a pretty solid relationship. Wouldn't be anything specific, good or bad. He was always a good husband, and she was a good wife. I will say, I think it might be just, and this is my own personal view, I think it's a bit narcissistic in a lot of ways, because they had 3 kids, and their first child, William, died of, well, a whole bunch of different things, but I would probably say just convulsions. I don't even want to say convulsions, but, like epileptic, like seizures, I guess you could say, is probably one way to look at it. But they also had 2 other kids that they named after them. Chester Alan Arthur II and Ellen Herndon. Basically, they also named her Nell, and she would eventually get married. Those 2 would live for a very long life, to be quite honest with you. Both would actually live to at least be 50 plus, which, if you knew anything back then about the lifespans of a lot of different people, really wasn't that long, to be quite honest. But for Chester, Alan Arthur, and Nellie, they had a pretty good relationship. It's around this time, too, that a lot of things are happening. Machinations are really occurring. 1858, Civil War was effectively starting to break out within the country itself in many aspects. And he rejoined his state militia, specifically for, I guess you could say companionship, some bros in a lot of ways, and more political connections, but also in some way, shape, and form to serve his country, to fight for a cause that he wanted to fight for and believe in, ultimately. That being said, Civil War is going to break out 1860, 1861 on the advent of Abraham Lincoln's election into the presidency, and Chester Alan Arthur really didn't have a problem fighting, to be quite honest with you. But there's a lot of different things that were going on, specifically, and just for starters, his own home life. Nellie, his wife, her family was in Virginia. They're Southerners. They're Confederates, and it was funny. One book said that Chester Arthur would call his wife the Little Confederate, his rebel wife. Her family did not approve at all of Chester Arthur's ardent support of the Union and the Republican Party. And I just think it's a little interesting, little things like that. And their relationship at certain points was definitely strained, especially during this particular point in time with his career and the chaos of the country. Let's be honest and fair. And when war broke out, Chester Arthur offered up his services and wanted to fight, but ultimately, because of his Republican connections, was able to get a pretty sweet gig, becoming a quartermaster. In New York, the governor at the time was this guy, Edward Morgan. He was a Republican and a very powerful man at that, really, and Arthur was able to really get to know him through connections. That's one thing about Chester Arthur, is he was always able to make really good connections with people. He was a really personable person and was able to really just have a way of speaking in some aspects at the very least. He was a very personable person. It's probably the best way I can just explain it. Morgan helped Arthur get a lot of positions. Specifically, he was able to get the position of chief engineer, and then of the militia in New York, I believe, and then the quartermaster general for the entire state. And his rank at that point was a brigadier general. Arthur was in charge of feeding, housing, supplying hundreds of thousands of troops, which for a lot of people might be a bit difficult, but for him, he wasn't bogged down by government responsibilities like most people would be today. and he was pretty smart. He was a very able manager for a very difficult position and task. He championed this idea of requisitioning, and instead of basically having the government set up these kitchens and stuff like that, and having the government pay for everything through taxes and whatnot, he's basically just went with what some would say a free market approach, and ultimately actually saved the government a shit ton of money. Pardon my language. When, especially at a very pertinent time when the country's in a little bit of a chaotic point and position. For 2 years, Chester A. Arthur worked very closely with the governor, made more connections, etc., etc. Got the whole important patronage network of the New York Republican Party, which is very good for him. He was able to, find connections, able to get some things that were, I guess you could say, of the material good that people would like, the finer things in life. Although a lot of books always point out that Arthur, he didn't really skim anything off the top. He just basically got some stuff that he would normally get and didn't really take anything extra for that because he's this honorable person. And I don't know. I just feel like it's just one of those things that ultimately just doesn't really just get recorded because it's kind of pointless. And even then, it's like, at worst, it seems like it could be potentially like corruption, but that's about it. But I'll put it to you this way: when he was the quartermaster doing these things, he did a really good job for the Republican Party and specifically for the Union, and did everything he could at no cost of the government, and at the very least, at worst, probably just took maybe an extra wine bottle or two they just gave him, and didn't take anything extra because of that. So, good kudos for Chester A. Arthur. Things would change, though, in the midterm elections that would be occurring in 1862-1863. His specific position as the quartermaster of the state of New York was a appointed position. It wasn't anything that was earned specifically or anything like that. It was an appointment. And ultimately, when the midterm elections came around and a man named Horatio Seymour would actually win the governorship, he, too, would unfortunately lose his quartermastership. Although in the next election in 1864, when Reuben Fenton, I believe, when he won in 1864, Arthur attempted to try and get that job back, but ultimately wasn't able to get it because of political differences. The difference between like a Stallworth and the different factions of the Republican Party ultimately didn't precluded him ultimately from getting that position. So after he loses his position, Chester A. Arthur decides, I'll just go back to being a lawyer for the most part. He did not enlist for active duty in the combat, and ultimately they didn't require him to get it. So, I guess, it is what it is. So Chester A. Arthur, after basically 1863, when he leaves office, returns to become a full-time lawyer. As a lawyer, he ultimately did everything. Again, he basically was embroiled within the draft riots of 1863 in New York. He was basically a part of importing legalities, etc., and ultimately just other social crises that happened within New York and just different places. I guess what I'm trying to say is that he did everything. He was a very busy man, so busy in fact that his wife Nell actually started getting a little bit frustrated at times. It wasn't that she didn't like being a hostess or anything like that. It was more so just like, he's doing everything. He's blurring lines a little bit in terms of his social life, professional life, etc., etc. A couple books make very interesting points where it's one book I read, which is one of the main books I use, basically says that his future career depended more so on social aptitude than his actual legal acumen. It's one thing that a good lawyer might win cases, but to win, the big businesses, etc., the wealthy people, it's one thing to have a client, but to have a powerful client, that's another issue entirely. And, they can't make a determination whether he was conscious of what he was doing, ultimately, as he ended up unintentionally or intentionally improving in life in terms of a social and professional advancement, ultimately. And at the same time, it is understandable. Two things: he was always a very cheerful man, never had a negative attitude or little bone in his body for the most part, and ultimately really believed wholeheartedly and fundamentally within his principles of racial equality, and really believed in at least what the Republican Party was doing. once the war's ending, things for Arthur are up and down. His family was very close. They had just lost their first child, unfortunately, and I reread a section, and I believe it was inflammation within the brain itself, unfortunately. I think it was an infection that caused inflammation of the brain, specifically, that left them in mourning, but, times were very difficult for them back then. That being said, when the war was over, they both relished and loved the end and wanted some semblance of normalcy back again, and ultimately ended up being secluded from life for quite a long time, about 6 months to a year almost, as the family deeply mourned everything that had just really occurred over the time of the Civil War. Things were good, effectively. Eventually they were good. It takes time. It's tough to lose a child, but just you're busy, life gets chaotic, and the one thing you always want to do is just see your wife more, and it's tough, and it's very difficult periods that really show in a lot of ways the true character of men and people in general. For Arthur, it was always, I'm going to push forward. There's never a lack of confidence within him. It's also around this particular time, too, he's making more friends, more people that he's knowing are getting, specifically, I guess you could say, positions of power. Ex-Governor the Morgan would actually be a part of the United States Senate soon after. Thomas Murphy was another powerful Republican politician. He was actually a friend of William Tweed of the Tammany Hall Democrats, basically, and would actually end up meeting along the lines and along the way here Roscoe Conkling around this particular point in time, too. The end of the war was really good, ultimately, for Arthur. He had a lot of opportunities. Imagine, he's basically, maybe 35, 36 years old at this point. He's still young, at least by our standards. Back then, he's probably middle-aged. But ultimately, he has a lot of connections. Ultimately, everyone's going in. He knows everybody, and they know him. And it's really interesting because, like I said before about the differences in political ideologies, there's the radical Republicans, and then there's probably the much more conservative Republicans. And Arthur would probably, ideologically speaking, be considered a radical Republican in some ways. But ironically, he didn't actually fully believe in the ideology or have the passion, I guess you could say, that the radical Republicans had, which ultimately allowed him to really kind of go more into the circle of the conservative Republicans, which is good because, he's probably the closest thing to a radical that you can get without actually being a radical. And for the conservative Republicans, it kind of gave him some more swing, some more power, because Chester A. Arthur is kind of that weird, I guess you could say, future politician or future figure that has, he's got feet in both, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And for him, he would be a part of the Thurlow Tweed, the Republican patronage power, the stuff of legends, etc., and specifically the rising star within the Republican Party, and specifically in New York, who was kind of like the understudy of Thurlow Weed, Roscoe Conkling. And life would really never be the same for Chester A. Arthur once he met Roscoe Conkling, and the future would unfold.